Today we're uncovering the hidden secrets of one of America's most influential dynasties, the Flagler family. From co-founding the Standard Oil Empire alongside John D. Rockefeller to building the Florida East Coast Railway that revolutionized Florida's economy, Henry Morrison Flagler and his descendants not only amassed staggering wealth but also found themselves entangled in a web of fascinating stories. Scandals involving Henry's third wife, mysterious deaths, clandestine affairs, and even alleged labor abuses all shroud the Flagler family legacy in intrigue. Yet it's not all controversy. This family is also known for extensive philanthropy, rivaling that of the Rockefellers and the Onassis clan, as well as shrewdly preserving their fortune to avoid the pitfalls of families like the Vanderbilts. Join us as we delve deep into the history, the calculated moves behind the fortunes, and the untold secrets of the Flagler family. From new money to old money picture, massive fortunes being built almost overnight by people who used innovation, strategy, and sometimes ruthless tactics. Now bring your focus to one such empire, the Flagler family, whose wealth originated from the vast Standard Oil fortune. Founded in large part through the efforts of Henry Morrison Flagler and John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil was not just any business. It was one of the most influential and at times controversial corporations of its era. Many consider it the blueprint for modern monopolies. Yet, for all the formidable power and astonishing resources that Henry Flagler's empire commanded, it started as new money, much like Henry Clay Frick's Coke fortune in Pennsylvania, or Andrew Carnegie's Steel Empire. This new money label carried both prestige and stigma. Prestige because it meant massive wealth. Stigma because such fortunes were often viewed with suspicion by old guard families who had inherited their money. Over time, the Flaglers worked diligently to transform their standing in society, moving from new money upstarts to recognized old money aristocrats, employing strategic philanthropy, lavish real estate projects, and carefully arranged marriages to achieve that elevated position. Let's begin by examining how exactly this fortune came to be. According to multiple historical accounts, Henry Morrison Flagler was born in 1830 in Hopewell, New York, to a family of modest means. It is said that in his youth, he tried various businesses, including a stint as a grain merchant, but his true breakthrough came when he encountered John D. Rockefeller. Together they would co-found Standard Oil in 1870. At the time, petroleum was shaping up to be the fuel of the future. Oil lamps were replacing whale oil, and the industrial age demanded a more efficient energy source. Standard Oil quickly grew to dominate the oil industry, thanks in large part to savvy negotiations with railroads, aggressive acquisitions of smaller competitors, and the ability to refine and ship petroleum at prices few could compete with. Historians such as Ron Chernow, in his biography of Rockefeller, highlight how Flagler was instrumental in negotiating freight rates and expansions for the fledgling company. Without these negotiations, Standard Oil might not have crushed its rivals so thoroughly or so fast. While Standard Oil's domination made men like Rockefeller and Flagler unimaginably wealthy, it also made them lightning rods for criticism. Their firm came to personify monopoly power. In 1911, after years of antitrust litigation, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil into smaller entities. By then, both Rockefeller and Flagler had already reaped extraordinary profits. When Standard Oil was forced to break up, the combined stock in these various new companies remained highly valuable. Some of the offshoots would later become giants like Exxon, Mobil, or Chevron, names known worldwide. So, for Henry Flagler, the journey from a modest background to controlling a giant slice of America's energy supply was meteoric. Wealth from Standard Oil was considered the definition of new money. It was built in a single generation, derived from industrial might, and often looked down upon by families who trace their money to pre-Revolutionary War land holdings or old shipping and banking fortunes like the Astors or the Schuylers. But Henry Flagler wasn't content with simply enjoying a fresh windfall. Eager to diversify and grow his holdings, he turned his eye to Florida. Historians often credit him, alongside a few others, for inventing modern Florida tourism. By building the Florida East Coast Railway, Flagler was able to connect Florida's East Coast in a way that enticed wealthy northern tourists to visit. Much like how the Southern Pacific Railroad helped develop the West Coast, the Florida East Coast Railway spurred the growth of hotels, resorts, and entire communities. It was also extremely profitable for Flagler. As one might expect, these rail and real estate ventures significantly multiplied his already massive wealth. Along the way, Henry Flagler also engaged in extensive real estate development, erecting grand hotels like the Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine, the Royal Poinciana in Palm Beach, and the Breakers, also in Palm Beach. From a modern perspective, the Breakers is still considered an iconic hotel, hosting countless celebrities, politicians, and society figures. When it first opened, it rivaled other spectacular private estates such as William Randolph Hearst's Castle in San Simeon in terms of scale and ambition. The Ponce de Leon, for instance, featured Tiffany windows, Louis Comfort Tiffany's distinctive stained glass artistry that also adorned some of America's grandest homes of the Gilded Age. The presence of these Tiffany windows is often cited as a testament to Flagler's interest in cultural patronage. Some compare it to the Guggenheim family's dedication to collecting and showcasing modern art. However, the transition from new money to old money was not purely about constructing grand buildings. Rather, it was a multifaceted process involving philanthropy, social alliances, carefully negotiated marriages, and cultural patronage. In the realm of philanthropy, Mary Lily Keenan Flagler, Henry Flagler's third wife, played an active role. She made a significant donation of $75,000 to the University of North Carolina, UNC, an act that many historians cite as a key early endowment that would eventually pave the way for the Keenan Flagler Business School, a renowned institution today. $75,000 at the turn of the 20th century might sound small compared to modern philanthropic gifts, but adjusted for inflation, it was a substantial contribution and signaled a significant dedication to higher education. Many commentators liken that philanthropic step to Andrew Mellon's founding of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., or even Henry Clay Frick's establishment of the Frick Collection in New York. Through these endowments, families like the Flaglers, Fricks, and Mellons sought both to give back to society and to bolster their reputations in circles where old money families typically dominated. Beyond philanthropy, real estate was another arena for showcasing refinement and cultural influence. The Whitehall Mansion in Palm Beach, now the Flagler Museum, was built by Henry Flagler as a gift to his wife. This Beaux Arts-style palace came to define an era of opulence in South Florida. Contemporary newspaper articles from the early 1900s marveled at Whitehall's grandeur, describing it as one of the most beautiful homes in the United States. By building something that many have compared to the palatial estates of European nobility, the Flaglers were making a statement about their cultural aspirations. As with the Breakers, Whitehall was placed in competition with the grand residences of other American magnates, Hearst Castle in California, the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, or the Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island. If old money families had their generations-old homes in Manhattan or Newport, the Flaglers were determined to create equivalents in Florida. Marriages were likewise a critical strategy for forging social respectability. One noteworthy union was Mary Lily Flagler's marriage to Robert Worth Bingham following Henry Flagler's death. Robert Worth Bingham was a man of significant social standing, later serving as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom during Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. By linking the Flagler wealth to a figure involved in diplomacy and politics, Mary Lily arguably sought greater social legitimacy, akin to the marriages that the Cavendish family in England arranged to bolster their standing. During the Gilded Age, it was not uncommon for wealthy American heiresses to marry European aristocrats, famously exemplified by Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough. In the Flaglers' case, the emphasis was more on domestic political and social alliances than transatlantic ones, but the principle remained. These unions were partly about merging fortunes and partly about seeking acceptance in upper-crust circles that historically viewed industrial wealth with distrust. Of course, not all the Flagler stories glistened with success. There were also scandals, particularly surrounding Henry Flagler's multiple divorces and the mysterious death of Mary Lily in 1917. Rumors abounded that her passing was surrounded by questionable circumstances. Some said she was in failing health, others alleged foul play, and still others speculated about tensions within the family or with her second husband, Robert Worth Bingham. This sequence of events, combined with divorce controversies, cast a shadow on the Flagler name. In that regard, the Flaglers' social status was never fully secure, somewhat mirroring the saga of Edward Dehany, the oil tycoon ensnared in the Teapot Dome scandal during Warren G. Harding's presidency. Wealth alone did not insulate them from scandal or from being associated with unscrupulous behavior. Despite the best efforts to shift from new money to old money, the controversies often followed them, overshadowing philanthropic gestures and cultural patronage. Yet, even with these hiccups, one must recognize that the Flagler fortune, under the stewardship of the Keenan family, endured where others did not. The comparison is sometimes made to the Goulds, whose wealth famously dissipated across subsequent generations. The Canaan family's management strategies resembled those of Andrew Mellon, who carefully preserved and expanded his family's fortune long after the initial capital accumulation phase. In the Flaglers' case, the structure of trusts established well before Henry Flagler's death helped maintain the wealth for many decades, avoiding some of the pitfalls that come when heirs have unfettered access to enormous sums. However, Mary Lily's untimely death did reduce some of the direct control over the estate. This shift meant that more managers and legal frameworks came into play, in some ways stabilizing the fortune, though it introduced complexities regarding who had power over certain allocations. Mary Lily Keenan's mysterious death in 1917, the Gilded Age was winding down, but remnants of its opulence still shimmered in high society. Into this world stepped a figure whose name stirred awe and intrigue. Mary Lily Keenan, a wealthy heiress whose sudden death created shockwaves well beyond the grand estates of Florida and the refined salons of the American East Coast. Barely 8 months into her marriage to Robert Worth Bingham, she passed away under circumstances so peculiar that whispers of foul play still echo across the decades. At the center of the story is not only her personal fortune, but also the claims of questionable medical practices, large doses of morphine, rumors of addiction, and, most strikingly, a secret autopsy conducted in the dead of night. Put it all together, and you get a tale more riveting than any dime store novel. Was Mary Lily Keenan murdered for millions, or did her own ailments and dependencies pave the way for her untimely end? The narrative begins with an undeniable fact. Mary Lilly died in July 1917. She was widely recognized for inheriting and controlling a considerable share of wealth, money that attracted public attention, and some say the interest of opportunistic suitors. She married Robert Worth Bingham roughly 8 months before her death. Within this short window, several events converged: alleged excessive morphine use under Dr. Michael Ravitch's care, intensifying health problems, and a significant late addition to her will, granting Bingham $5 million. Observers of the day couldn't help but notice the suspicious timing. Only a few years prior, public discourse had been rife with sensational stories about wealthy heirs and heiresses, fueling a climate in which conspiracy theories about Mary Lilly's death found fertile ground. If you scan through historical newspapers from the period, you'll find columns speculating about her final days, her physical condition, and the possibility that her new husband played a role in orchestrating an inheritance windfall for himself. Opiates were far more common in medical prescriptions than they are today. Doctors used morphine liberally to manage all sorts of maladies, from chronic pain to hysteria. The medical field was far less regulated, and lethal overdoses or addiction were not uncommon. Mary Lilly's attending physician, Dr. Michael Ravitch, reportedly administered morphine to her in doses that some believed were dangerously high. If you delve into archived medical journals or the personal accounts of doctors practicing at that time, you'll find a range of viewpoints on whether such doses were standard or excessive. Nevertheless, the rumors that Mary Lilly became severely addicted, suffering convulsions and other dire symptoms, lend credence to theories that her final days were fraught with physical turmoil. She may well have been unable to make clear decisions, which might have left her vulnerable to external influence, particularly regarding the changes to her will. A crucial piece of this puzzle is the secret autopsy rumored to have been conducted at midnight shortly after Mary Lilly's passing. A clandestine autopsy is already a magnet for speculation, but add to it the fact that details of the procedure were never fully disclosed, and the suspicions multiply exponentially. Critics, some from her extended social circle and others from among the ranks of local gossip columnists, asserted that such secrecy suggested a cover-up. Could the autopsy have revealed lethal levels of morphine in her system? Did it implicate specific individuals who stood to benefit from her demise? Or was it, as some defenders of the family claimed, a purely private affair to shield the heiress's dignity from prying eyes? Understanding the environment in which Mary Lilly lived is pivotal to determining whether murder was a plausible scenario. The early 1900s in America was an era of marked inequality. In major cities, fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. Society pages thrived on stories of wealthy families, their scandals, their romances, and their legacies. The fascination with millionaires and heiresses was at an all-time high, often stoked by salacious rumors. If a wealthy individual died under circumstances that were less than straightforward, speculation inevitably followed. Public appetite for dramatic stories was insatiable, reminiscent of how modern audiences gravitate towards celebrity gossip or sensational court cases. So, Mary Lilly, already a figure of curiosity for her inheritance and marriage, became front-page fodder when she died. The fervor around her story paralleled other high-profile controversies, like the mysterious death of Thomas Ince aboard William Randolph Hearst's yacht, or the swirling rumors around the personal life of Edward Doheny, the oil tycoon embroiled in the infamous scandal that involved bribery, murder-suicide allegations, and lingering doubt among historians. Speaking of Doheny, many observers drew comparisons to the tragedy that struck his family. The convergence of wealth, possible foul play, and scandal made both stories prime examples of how money can sometimes bring not just comfort, but also danger. In Doheny's case, the story involved an alleged murder-suicide that cast a long shadow over his empire, while in Mary Lily's saga, the shadow took the form of a suspected morphine overdose encouraged, or at least permitted, by those closest to her. Though the details differ, the shared undercurrent is that in the highest echelons of society, unseemly behavior could be cloaked behind gilded doors. The princes in the Tower parallel from medieval England, often invoked when wealthy or influential figures die mysteriously, appears here as well. That historical reference to the disappearance and presumed murder of two royal princes echoes the type of hush-hush investigation that some believe happened with Mary Lily's midnight autopsy. In both situations, accusations swirl about powerful individuals orchestrating events to secure wealth or political advantage. Now let's talk about Robert Worth Bingham. He was not merely a random suitor who drifted into Mary Lily's life. In fact, he had a background that afforded him a certain degree of prestige. He went on to become a diplomat of sorts, a fact that for some underscores a capacity for calculated maneuvering. The question that inevitably arises: did Bingham orchestrate the addition of the $5 million provision in Mary Lily's will, aware of her deteriorating health? The timing remains provocative. She altered her will late in the game, then perished within months, leaving Bingham significantly enriched. Those suspicious of him pointed to the fact that this inheritance was no small sum, especially in 1917. $5 million then would be worth a tremendously larger amount today. One might recall how Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis was rumored to be cursed following the tragic ends of his loved ones, leading some watchers to speculate about a curse befalling those who come into sudden colossal wealth. Did Mary Lily's fortune carry a similar sense of doom, culminating in her untimely end and then overshadowing the man who inherited her estate? While many in Mary Lily's circle believe something sinister took place, the lack of concrete evidence remains a stumbling block for those who want to label her death a murder. Yes, the hush-hush nature of the autopsy is suspicious. Yes, the morphine addiction was real, and the changes to the will were suspiciously timed, but the question of how these elements intersect is an open-ended one. People close to Bingham and Dr. Ravitch insisted that Mary Lily's health had been declining severely, possibly from an underlying condition that demanded heavy doses of pain medication. Medical historians who study that period point out that morphine was, in many cases, considered the only meaningful way to keep patients comfortable when dealing with chronic pain or terminal illnesses. Then again, the line between comfort measures and excessive sedation was hazy at best, leaving a wide berth for potential wrongdoing. Flagler's illegitimate child cover-up. Henry Flagler, co-founder of an oil empire, builder of railroads, and a central player in Florida's transformation into a magnet for the wealthy. Yet, what many people don't realize is that he may have carried with him a secret that could have shattered his public image, the possibility of an illegitimate daughter, hidden in plain sight under another family's roof. There's a suggestion in historical circles that around 1895, Henry Flagler and Mary Lily Keenan brought a child into the world, a daughter named Mary Louise. The rumor goes that she was quietly handed off to be raised by a woman named Jessie Wise. That arrangement, according to several authors and researchers, was no accident. The speculation is that Flagler and Mary Lily created a cover story to protect themselves from the explosion of gossip and social outrage that would have followed had word gotten out about their affair. This was all happening before Henry officially ended his marriage to Ida Alice Flagler in 1901. If you dig into personal letters, diaries, and the scraps of evidence that sometimes appear in genealogical forums, you'll discover that quite a few historians believe this cover-up was a deliberate move to preserve Flagler's carefully managed reputation and Mary Lily's social standing. Think of the Gilded Age norms and how they defined the era. Marriages among the super-rich often doubled as business alliances, and public image was at a premium. Scandals involving illegitimate children, if proven, were bombshells that could bring undue scrutiny or jeopardize carefully arranged business ventures. That's why wealthy families sometimes resorted to elaborate ruses to hide illegitimate offspring. The wealthy media tycoon William Randolph Hearst, for instance, reportedly kept secrets about a child fathered out of wedlock, illustrating that Flagler wouldn't have been alone in wanting to manage the narrative. Digging deeper, you'll see parallels in how other prominent families coped with such controversies. Leaders in European aristocracy or powerful U.S. political dynasties also had a knack for official silences when it came to unacknowledged offspring. So, where does Mary Lily fit in? She was a charismatic and intelligent woman who later inherited a substantial fortune. Many accounts point to her closeness with Henry Flagler, suggesting an intense emotional bond that was about more than just friendly visits or business discussions. If the daughter, Mary Louise, truly existed, it would be a logical extension of a hidden relationship that might have flourished while Flagler was still legally bound to Ida Alice. From a moral standpoint, late 19th century society would have frowned upon such an affair. Yet in practice, those with money and connections often found discreet ways to navigate scandal. Sometimes children were passed off to relatives. Other times they were sent abroad or to more discreet locations to grow up under assumed identities. Some families quietly arranged adoption by loyal friends or staff, ensuring the child was cared for, but without attracting gossip columnists or social critics. Jessie Wise's role in this story is particularly curious. By various historical accounts, she ended up raising Mary Louise as her own, thereby insulating Flagler and Mary Lily from direct responsibility. Little details like birth dates, baptism records, and early photographs, if they still exist, might shed light on whether Mary Louise was born at the time claimed by these rumors. Historians who focus on genealogical research sometimes uncover subtle references or cryptic mentions in private letters that suggest a hush-hush child existed. In one example, a letter might have indicated that Mary Louise had an uncanny resemblance to Henry Flagler. Another might suggest that Mary Lily was inexplicably absent from certain social events around the same time Mary Louise was rumored to be born. While none of this is concrete proof, it adds a layer of intrigue. When drawing parallels, it's easy to recall the rumors surrounding Theodore Roosevelt's daughter Alice, whose paternity was questioned in some circles, even though established history typically dismisses those claims. Or consider the Medici family in Renaissance Italy, where hidden heirs sometimes popped up in court battles over inheritance. Such tales fascinate us because they remind us that even the most powerful dynasties are rarely free of scandal. And that's precisely the kind of environment in which the Flagler secret could have thrived. A climate that valued appearances but was rife with subterranean rumors. We must remember that Flagler was a man of considerable wealth and reach. He owned massive properties in Florida, including luxury hotels, and held a dominant stake in an oil empire that influenced national economics. By the time questions arose about a hidden child, he had ample resources to stage a discreet arrangement and was no stranger to reshaping public perceptions. He had, after all, built entire stretches of railroad and real estate developments that branded Florida as a premier vacation spot. The broader point is that in a world where an entire hotel or a new community could be created with one signature, redirecting attention from a child would be surprisingly feasible. Mary Lilly, for her part, came from a family that was neither powerless nor irrelevant. Their marriage alliances, philanthropic gestures, and entrepreneurial ventures knitted them into the social and economic fabric of the region. An unexpected pregnancy could have upset the balance for both families, casting doubt on alliances and overshadowing the careful philanthropic image Mary Lilly later cultivated. Historians sometimes suggest that Mary Lilly's subsequent prominence, her inheritance, her role in various institutions, makes the story of a secret child all the more gripping. Can you imagine how differently her legacy might be viewed if the public had learned that she and Flagler orchestrated a hidden adoption scheme? Of course, this secret wouldn't have been as simple as handing a baby over and forgetting about her. One might ask, did Mary Lilly maintain contact with the child? Were there ongoing financial provisions secretly funneled to Jesse Wise? Clues might hide in old bank records or household ledgers. Women of Mary Lilly's standing might have left journals that, while carefully coded, still hinted at a hidden heartbreak or joy at seeing a daughter from a distance. The difficulty is that many of these potential archival sources could have been intentionally destroyed. Powerful families have been known to burn correspondence or bribe record keepers to keep such matters from surfacing. Ultimately, whether or not Mary Louise was truly Flagler's daughter, the mere existence of such a rumor underscores the complicated, often secretive nature of Gilded Age relationships. Powerful men like Henry Flagler had the resources to shape not just cities and industries, but also the narratives around their private lives. Women like Mary Lilly Keenan, though confined by societal expectations, could leverage their family's standing to orchestrate certain arrangements when faced with an unplanned pregnancy. The end result is a tale that holds our attention because it's not only about money or status, it's also a story about human frailty, longing, and the lengths people will go to protect themselves in a judgmental society. Ida Alice's insanity divorce scandal. Henry Flagler. Some people knew him for his role in building an oil dynasty, others for his transformation of Florida into a tourist's paradise. But there was another side to his story that made society pages sizzle. His tumultuous divorce from Ida Alice Shords, driven by allegations of insanity and backed, or so the talk went, by strategically placed bribes that reshaped Florida's divorce laws. From one perspective, Henry Flagler was the perfect embodiment of the Gilded Age dream. He'd co-founded an empire that revolutionized the oil industry and emerged with money to spare, fueling lavish spending on megaprojects across Florida. Yet behind the glitter of that public success lay personal dramas that revealed just how far he might go to protect his interests and maintain his image. His second marriage to Ida Alice is a prime example of this dynamic, featuring a legal stratagem so controversial it rattled the era's moral guardians. To understand why this divorce became such a lightning rod, we first have to set the scene. Henry Flagler had already been married once before to Mary Harkness, who tragically passed away. He later married Ida, a woman described in contemporary newspaper columns as both charming and high-spirited. She entered Henry's orbit at a time when he was riding high on Standard Oil profits and pushing the boundaries of possibility in Florida, real estate, and railroads. Some accounts suggest that Ida, in the early days of their marriage, was a supportive partner, traveling with him, attending high society gatherings, and reveling in the prosperity that enveloped them. But over time, strains emerged. Ida began exhibiting behavior that friends and acquaintances found concerning. There were rumors of eccentric outbursts, spiritual seances, and extravagant spending sprees. However, wealthy social circles could often tolerate eccentricities so long as they remained behind closed doors. The real trouble began when Henry Flagler decided their relationship needed a more radical solution. According to multiple historical notes, including Florida legislative records from that era, Henry faced a legal quandary. Divorce in Florida wasn't straightforward. At the time, the grounds for dissolving a marriage were narrowly defined, and none would have easily applied to Ida's condition, unless, of course, he or his associates managed to persuade legislators to alter the rules, and that, say those who've poured through the legislative history, is precisely what he did. Although the exact mechanics of the alleged bribery remain obscure, few written documents explicitly confirm money changing hands. Numerous researchers argue that something extraordinary happened in 1901. Florida lawmakers introduced, debated, and passed a new provision allowing divorce on the grounds of incurable insanity. Almost immediately after this legislation took effect, Henry Flagler moved to end his marriage to Ida, citing her confinement in a mental institution and her presumed inability to recover. If you dig into archived Florida newspapers, you'll find guarded references to the passage of a divorce law that benefited one prominent industrialist. Local gossip columns at the time occasionally alluded to a wealthy northern investor who had reasons for wanting the law changed, though they rarely named him outright. Considering Henry's towering presence in Florida, he was essentially the force behind entire cities' development. It's easy to see why editors might have hesitated to publish more explicit accusations. The reason this raised eyebrows far beyond Florida was that bribing a state legislature, if that is indeed what happened, represented a seismic breach of ethics and law. Remember, this was the same Gilded Age environment in which other titans like Jay Gould had famously colluded with political figures such as William Boss Tweed in New York to secure favorable outcomes for their business interests. People drew parallels between Flagler's Florida dealings and Gould's manipulation of New York's municipal politics. While the details differ, the underlying theme was the same: the shock that a man of immense wealth would use it so shamelessly to bend public institutions to his personal will. And while some social commentators of the day insisted such tactics were not unique in a corrupt era, the uniqueness lay in the directness with which Flagler allegedly targeted the divorce laws themselves, something that hit close to home for many families whose marriages didn't enjoy a billionaire's capacity for rewriting legal codes. Yet the scandal wasn't confined to legislative manipulation. Adding fuel to the fire was the hush-hush settlement awarded to Ida as part of the divorce arrangement. The figure bandied about in various accounts is $1.2 million, a sum that soared to the equivalent of roughly $12 million by 1930 standards, and would be far more by today's calculations. It was a breathtaking payout, but in the world of high society, the real question was why so few people knew about it at the time. Rumor has it that Henry Flagler insisted on absolute discretion regarding the settlement. After all, knowledge that he had not only ended his marriage on the grounds of Ida's mental instability, but also paid her a handsome fortune to keep silent might have triggered a more intense public outcry. This was, after all, the same era that loved to devour stories of scandal in tabloids and gossip columns. The hush-hush nature of the settlement was reminiscent of other behind-closed-doors arrangements among the elite. Consider the Cavendish family in England, whose intricate inheritance rules sometimes led to sudden disinheritances for family members who displeased the family patriarch, or Andrew Mellon, an American financier whose complex dealings occasionally raised eyebrows regarding potential tax avoidance. While these parallels involve different legal or financial maneuvers, they underline a shared reality. For the ultra-wealthy, there were always ways to tip the scales of the legal system or to navigate around public scrutiny when they had the right resources at hand. What set Flagler's case apart was how public it became, at least in rumor form. For one thing, Henry Flagler was a giant in Florida, a man whose money built hotels that rivaled Europe's finest, whose railway lines connected remote parts of the peninsula, and whose philanthropic gestures could sway the direction of entire communities. The notion that he might stoop to bribery, let alone that he felt compelled to, fascinated people. Indeed, it wasn't as though Henry couldn't have traveled to another jurisdiction with looser divorce laws. Some states or even certain foreign locales were rumored to welcome Americans seeking quick divorces for a suitable fee. Yet Henry apparently wanted Florida to be the place where his marriage was undone, possibly because his business and social life were so tightly knit there. He wanted a local seal of approval, complete with the veneer of legitimacy. By corralling the legislature into passing a law that fit his case perfectly, he guaranteed an outcome on home turf. Then there's Ida's side of the story. She was institutionalized, officially deemed insane, and incapable of fulfilling her marital duties. Depending on whom you ask, Ida was indeed suffering from serious mental health issues. Some descriptions portray her as increasingly unstable, prone to delusions and emotional extremes. Others hint that she might have been strong-willed, possibly clashing with Henry's controlling nature, and was declared insane in a strategic move to expedite the divorce. A few modern commentators have even suggested that her supposed insanity was exaggerated or staged to justify the legislative push. However, documented evidence of a deliberate staging remains elusive, and most historians lean toward the idea that Ida did have genuine mental health challenges. Still, the timing and convenience of it all played directly into Henry's hands when he sought that new divorce statute. Those who suspect a staged insanity often point to the old truism that unscrupulous men of power sometimes found it easier to label a spouse or family member crazy rather than deal with them directly. While that suspicion hovers around this case, definitive proof has never emerged. If someone hoped to find a smoking gun that showed Henry paying off doctors or forging psychiatric evaluations, they've come up empty-handed. Even Ida's medical files, where available, often contain incomplete notes or vague references to her condition. Hospitals and asylums from the early 20th century didn't always maintain scrupulously detailed records, and wealthy benefactors could sometimes influence what was or wasn't officially documented. Meanwhile, Henry's second marriage to Ida ended quietly enough in a strictly legal sense once the new law was in place. Official statements declared their union dissolved due to Ida's incurable insanity, and Henry moved on. He remarried not long after, forging yet another bond that attracted its own swirl of rumors and controversies. Ida, on the other hand, lived out her days in seclusion. Some say that although she benefited from the settlement, her life post-divorce was lonely, overshadowed by mental health struggles, and the sense that she had been cast aside by a man whose unstoppable ambition placed her on the losing end of a transaction. Intriguingly, a few contemporary accounts mention that Ida occasionally corresponded with old friends, but no letters that might cast fresh light on the divorce or the alleged bribes have ever been publicly verified. For the broader public of the early 1900s, this scandal was fodder for speculation about the moral compass of America's new oligarchs. People recognized that Henry Flagler was hardly alone in employing questionable tactics. Other families, such as the Goulds, had faced their own share of allegations regarding collusion with corrupt political machines. The difference lay in the personal nature of Flagler's aim, adjusting a state's legal definition of marriage and divorce to extricate himself from a union that no longer served him. While wealthy industrialists often manipulated markets, public opinion, or labor policies rewriting divorce laws was an unusually brazen move. For that reason, many saw it as a fresh example of how boundless money could interfere with institutions designed to serve the public good. Standard Oil's Cleveland Massacre converti deals. John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler stood out for their cunning financial discipline and a willingness to do whatever it took to control an entire industry. Their partnership in Standard Oil would eventually reshape global commerce, but one of the most dramatic episodes in their empire building has gone down in history as the Cleveland Massacre. In 1872, through a combination of secret deals, bribes, and plain old intimidation, Rockefeller and Flagler engineered the takeover of nearly all rival refineries in Cleveland, about 22 out of 26, effectively centralizing oil refining in their hands and cementing Standard Oil as the behemoth of its era. To understand why this event was so explosive, you need to picture Cleveland at the time. It was fast becoming a major refining hub thanks to the bounty of crude oil being pumped from Pennsylvania fields and shipped by rail or waterways. Dozens of small and medium-sized refineries dotted the city. These were independent outfits that at first had no intention of bowing to any central authority, especially not to Rockefeller, whom they saw as a relentless competitor with a sharp eye for cornering railroad freight deals. But John D. Rockefeller was already forging exclusive relationships with rail lines, leveraging every possible advantage. Henry Flagler, meanwhile, was his right-hand man, a business strategist second to none, known for his diplomatic approach but also for behind-the-scenes negotiations that made him indispensable to the Standard Oil juggernaut. While Rockefeller negotiated freight rebates and pored over balance sheets, Flagler often played the smoother operator, gathering inside information or striking quiet bargains. It wasn't just about economics, it was about controlling the narrative, controlling supply lines, and making sure no competitor had a fighting chance. The so-called Cleveland Massacre of 1872 takes its name from the sheer speed and scope of the acquisitions. Almost overnight, Standard Oil scooped up or forced out nearly 24 refineries. This wasn't simply about offering a good price. The story goes that Rockefeller and Flagler held secret meetings with influential railroad executives, local power brokers, and even a few key refinery owners who might have been open to a well-timed bribe. In an era before rigorous regulations, a handshake in a private parlor or an unrecorded transaction could shift entire markets. Rival refiners woke up to find that shipping their oil anywhere at a competitive rate had become nearly impossible. The railroads, cozy with Standard Oil, had adjusted freight rates, effectively punishing anyone who didn't sell out. According to recollections and contemporary newspaper hints, some of those refiners faced the unpleasant choice of either accepting the buyout or being run into bankruptcy by crippling shipping costs. The impetus for this blitz came from a concern that the refining industry was too fragmented, or at least that's how Rockefeller and Flagler spun it. They claimed greater efficiency and stability would come from centralizing production under one entity. This wasn't entirely untrue. Standard Oil did have a knack for streamlining processes, but behind the talk of efficiency lay some very deliberate tactics. Threats were made, urging certain competitors to sign on the dotted line or watch their businesses go under. Secret bribes were rumored to have changed hands, paying off railway officials to either slow shipments for holdouts or provide preferential treatment for Standard Oil affiliates. These same rivals would later argue that it wasn't just about shipping costs. Sometimes they received direct personal incentives to walk away from their refineries. The details vary depending on whose account you trust. Records were often vague or destroyed, but the overarching narrative remains consistent. Rockefeller and Flagler orchestrated a wave of knockdowns that consolidated Cleveland's refining capacity. If you fast forward a few decades, you'll see parallels with J.P. Morgan's activities around 1907, when he used the financial panic to strengthen his own banking empire. Morgan's interventions may have stabilized the markets temporarily, but they also advanced his power, fueling accusations that he profited handsomely from the crisis. Similar questions swirl around the Cleveland massacre. Was it a purely beneficial act of industrial consolidation, as Rockefeller's defenders claimed, or a ruthless exploitation of underhanded deals for personal enrichment? Many historians lean strongly toward the latter interpretation. The immediate result was that Standard Oil's grip tightened, and small refiners had nowhere to turn if they wanted to survive. It's important to note that this was not the only time Standard Oil used such tactics. The company had a pattern of forging alliances that squeezed out competitors through a combination of freight rebates, selective price wars, and carefully orchestrated buyouts. But the 1872 Cleveland episode stands out for its drama. 22 out of 26 refineries were gone, virtually overnight. That's a level of market consolidation so abrupt that people called it a massacre, implying not just an economic takeover, but a hostile obliteration. At the time, Rockefeller had already experimented with something called the South Improvement Company, a short-lived arrangement that gave Standard Oil and a few allies preferential freight rates. Public outrage eventually sank that scheme, but the Cleveland massacre showed that Standard Oil didn't need an official charter to accomplish similar goals. A web of informal deals, sealed behind closed doors, was enough to achieve the same end. Business historians frequently point to this period as a defining moment for the concept of the monopoly in America. Before federal antitrust legislation had teeth, corporate giants like Standard Oil could amass staggering power, dictating everything from supplier prices to consumer costs. The refiners that were absorbed in Cleveland often ended up working under the Standard umbrella, continuing operations, but funneling profits into Rockefeller and Flagler's coffers. A small number of them accepted shares in Standard Oil rather than a straightforward cash sale. For some, that turned out to be surprisingly profitable in the long run, because Standard shares soared as the company evolved into a global force. Yet the moral question remains: if you're given the option to sell or be crushed, is it really a fair deal? When you compare this to other notorious land grabs like the ones Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick orchestrated with steel operations or coal mines, the blueprint is familiar. First, undermine your competition by cutting supply lines or forging alliances with critical transport and resource networks. Next, send negotiators to buy out your competitors at rates they can't refuse, either because the price is decent or because the alternative is total ruin. Finally, repeat and expand until there's virtually no one left standing against you. Back in medieval times, the Umayyad Caliphate allegedly used tribal bribes and alliances to secure loyalty across vast territories, ensuring that no faction grew strong enough to challenge their rule. Rockefeller and Flagler's approach in Cleveland was an industrial version of that same logic. Keep potential adversaries on a leash by controlling their shipping costs, and if necessary, pay them off or starve them out. Overseas railway labor abuses, Flagler's folly, was convinced no line of steel and timber could survive the punishing hurricanes or the relentless corrosion of salt water. And yet between 1905 and 1912, Flagler's overseas railway started taking shape. It was hailed in promotional materials and local newspapers as an engineering marvel destined to revolutionize travel and commerce in southern Florida. But behind the triumphant headlines lay a darker side of that grand dream: the grueling labor conditions faced by thousands of workers, and the hush-hush approach to the staggering death toll inflicted by storms and disease. Stories of these labor abuses stretch back to the earliest days of construction. Newspaper advertisements had promised adventure, steady wages, and the chance to be part of history for those who signed on to build the railway across the Florida Keys. The workforce that responded was a diverse patchwork of backgrounds: African American men from the rural South, Caribbean laborers from islands such as Jamaica or the Bahamas, and European immigrants who had trickled into Florida ports. Some were skilled mechanics and carpenters. Others were desperate for work of any kind. Whatever their expertise or motivations, they ended up stationed on isolated keys, camping in makeshift tents or rudimentary barracks. Living conditions were often primitive. Drinking water could be scarce or brackish. Food shipments arrived irregularly, and swarms of mosquitoes brought malaria and other diseases to a population already worn down by punishing hours. While official records point to a workforce of roughly 4,000 people on the railway, anecdotal evidence suggests the ranks fluctuated wildly. Turnover was high. Some men arrived, took one look at the precarious job sites, and left on the next boat. Others tried to endure but found themselves beset by fevers and infections that for them spelled doom. Because health care in remote camp settings was minimal, a simple cut could lead to a festering wound, or a fever might spiral into a deadly malady. Local historians who've combed through personal diaries and fragments of letters report that many workers died far from any family. Their bodies either shipped home if they could afford it, or buried in unmarked graves on one of the keys. That there were hundreds of fatalities seems beyond dispute. The question is, how many? While official statements often mention some casualties, the whispered figure in contemporary newspapers ranged anywhere from a couple hundred to potentially double that. Disaster could strike in many ways. Hurricanes were the most obvious threat. Visitors to southern Florida might marvel at the serene turquoise waters and gentle breezes, but from June through November, the region's weather could turn terrifyingly violent. Powerful storms churned the ocean into a maelstrom that devoured the flimsy wooden structures housing the workers. High winds tossed rail segments like matchsticks. Flooding turned the low-lying land into a quagmire, and storm surges swept away entire camps in the blink of an eye. Journalists of the time occasionally tried to expose the extent of the losses, recounting horrifying anecdotes of men clinging to palm trees or drifting on makeshift rafts, never to be seen again. But such reports were often overshadowed by the official narrative of progress and determination. Flagler's team insisted that every effort was made to protect workers, yet critics countered that anticipating a monster storm might have been out of the question for men who had never experienced a Florida hurricane before. Disease, meanwhile, was a more persistent menace. Malaria, dengue fever, and other mosquito-borne illnesses found prime breeding grounds in the Keys' humid environment. Men weakened by long hours in the blazing sun were easy prey. Some newspapers published alarmist stories about the fever camps that dotted the job sites, complete with descriptions of men collapsing at the end of their shifts. Local doctors and charity workers occasionally stepped in, but resources remained sparse. Then there was the daily brutality of heavy manual labor, hauling materials, operating pile drivers, dredging and constructing railway trestles in precarious waters. Accidents involving falling beams or collapsed scaffolding were not uncommon. The difference between life and death could be a moment's distraction or a single piece of substandard equipment. Families that eventually inquired about lost or missing relatives often found official responses vague or unhelpful. Such conditions didn't just emerge spontaneously. They were exacerbated by a push for speed. Flagler believed that every year of delay represented lost opportunities in tourism and trade. The Florida Keys were seen as a portal to the Caribbean and Latin America, promising new shipping routes to Key West and beyond. Completion of the railway would, in his view, open a gateway that could rival or complement other ports. Investors grew anxious with each passing month, so the men driving the project had every incentive to keep quiet about anything that might slow construction or increase costs. The possibility of negative press particularly claims that the work was an ongoing humanitarian crisis, was a powerful motivation to hush up any notion of wrongdoing. Enter Henry Clay Frick. Historians typically remember him for his involvement in the steel industry and some particularly controversial episodes, including violent labor disputes. But sources also hint that Frick had a hand in shaping publicity strategies around Flagler's overseas railway. Perhaps it was a favor between powerful magnates or a direct involvement that has never been fully documented. In any case, many believe that Frick's influence was part of the reason coverage of worker deaths and harsh conditions remained so muted. While sensational stories might flare up in local papers, they seldom broke into the national conversation where Flagler's project was otherwise celebrated as an engineering wonder. Comparisons to the 1877 strike cover-up linked to Jay Gould are unavoidable here. Many industrialists of the Gilded Age were adept at suppressing negative headlines to protect both their reputations and their bottom lines. In the case of the Overseas Railway, talk of widespread labor abuses or significant death tolls would have tarnished the enterprise. Still, for those who took the time to probe deeper, the stories were there. Key West's own labor records, which survive in fragmentary form, note that a startling number of workers simply disappeared from the roster, which local archivists interpret as a sign of deaths not officially recorded or else individuals who fled under duress. Testimonies from workers who survived, even in short statements or secondhand accounts, describe an atmosphere of peril that overshadowed daily life. You might wake up to an eerily calm sunrise, your tent pitched next to the water, only to find a hurricane barreling toward you by midday. Evacuation plans were frequently inadequate. Although some foremen tried to sound the alarm, there wasn't always enough time or enough boats to ferry everyone out. In the aftermath of these disasters, the priority was to get the damaged track or piers back up and running, not to mourn the lost. In modern times, some commentators draw parallels between the Overseas Railway's labor conditions and events like the violence at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steelworks or DuPont's secrecy around PFOA contamination many decades later. The underlying theme is a willingness by corporate leadership to place efficiency or profit ahead of worker well-being. At Homestead, clashes between labor and management led to bloodshed. With DuPont, entire communities allege that information about toxic chemicals was concealed. In the Keys, no pitched battles erupted between workers and Pinkerton-like enforcers, nor were employees reportedly poisoned by chemical runoff. But the end result still cost many lives lost to storms, disease, and a lack of workplace safety considerations, casualties that appear to have been downplayed in the official telling of the Overseas Railway's saga. One striking difference between, say, the Homestead strike and the Overseas Railway is that the latter involved men laboring in remote outposts, far from the eyes of major metropolitan reporters. Carnegie Steel Mills sat near Pittsburgh, at the heart of a populous region, with newspapers that hungered for scandal. In the Florida Keys, watchers from big northern papers rarely ventured to cover day-to-day operations. Even local journalists might have needed passes or friendly relationships with the railway's management to access construction sites. If certain visitors grew too inquisitive, asking how many had died or why medical support was so threadbare, management would likely find ways to curtail their visits. After all, the entire operation was under private control, spread across remote islands connected only by rail barges or small boats. Because the railroad was Flagler's personal dream, the project lacked the usual oversight that might come from a governmental body. Public funding was minimal, so official investigations into workplace conditions rarely took place. When tragedy struck, like a camp destroyed by a hurricane, the official stance often blamed acts of God, portraying them as inevitable hazards of building in an extreme environment. Employee contracts, if they existed in writing at all, probably included disclaimers regarding the inherent risks. Crews were reminded they could quit if they found the conditions intolerable, but leaving often meant forfeiting any accrued wages. Those who were financially desperate had little choice but to keep working. The notion of Flagler's folly took hold in the public's imagination. While Flagler's champions hailed him as a visionary, critics said no rational businessman would try to lay tracks over open ocean, subject to nature's fury. Yet, despite repeated hurricane setbacks, he pressed on. Some observers asked whether the bravado fueling the project overshadowed a moral responsibility to protect its workforce. Did Flagler see the men as expendable, so long as the line eventually opened for service? The question remains contentious. By the standards of the Gilded Age, paternalistic attitudes toward labor were common, but there were also philanthropic gestures from various tycoons. Think of the libraries Andrew Carnegie built, or the philanthropic foundation set up by John D. Rockefeller. Yet no large-scale philanthropic program for overseas railway workers is evident. If it existed, it was overshadowed by the drive to finish on schedule. Those seeking the full truth might turn to diaries or letters from the men themselves. A scattered handful of personal correspondences survive, occasionally popping up in Florida history blogs or private collections. These writings speak of unrelenting heat, an undercurrent of fear about the next big storm, and the daily gamble of going to work on unstable scaffolding or half-finished bridges. Some mention men who arrived with hopes of returning home flush with money only to vanish without a trace. Others recount that certain supervisors genuinely tried to improve safety or reduce accidents, only to be overruled by higher-ups whose main concern was meeting deadlines. The sense you get is a workforce caught between the unstoppable force of nature and a corporate machine operating at breakneck speed. In fairness, not all experiences were disastrous. Some laborers found the wages decent compared to other opportunities available at the time. They might have been used to physically demanding jobs on farms or in factories, so the rigors of railway work didn't faze them. A few were promoted to oversee sections of track, eventually forging stable careers once the railway was done. Others found a modicum of camaraderie in the camps, forging friendships and supporting each other in the face of adversity. These glimpses of resilience don't erase the underlying issues, but they remind us that painting every worker's experience with the same grim brush can be misleading. Officially, the Overseas Railway opened in 1912, greeted by a wave of celebration. People marveled at the ability to board a train in Miami and ride it all the way to Key West, crossing long viaducts where ocean waters sparkled beneath the tracks. Magazine articles praised Flagler's triumph and declared that Florida's future had arrived. Photographs circulated, showing fancy passenger cars, dignitaries stepping onto Key West station platform, and Henry Flagler himself riding in one of the inaugural trains. The sheer spectacle of it all enthralled the public. Lost in the fanfare, though, was any mention of the hundreds who had died, or the living conditions that claimed so many. Indeed, some early travel brochures portrayed the railway as almost a leisurely project completed without significant hardship. Yet over time, rumors of the true costs kept surfacing. Word of mouth from former workers or Key West locals would occasionally filter into regional newspapers, especially during hurricane season when new storms battered the Keys. It was whispered that men's bones still lay beneath sunken pilings, or that a particular island was haunted by the spirits of drowned laborers. While those claims might veer into folklore, they reflect an enduring sense that something terrible happened behind the scenes, a tragedy glossed over by official accounts.